So how many scientists does it take to read the Joseph story? Well, Charlie's going to be our one. So this is the Joseph saga through the scientific lens. I was really so wonderfully pleased that Charlie agreed to do this, that we had a chavruta or two, starting in Sukkot and recently in the sanctuary, to really study Torah together, and for Charlie to bring his scientific scopes to the text, and a little archaeology to the text of the Torah is very exciting. And I was glad to be in that conversation and share thoughts and resources. And Charlie, I'll say up front that I was impressed with your sharp thinking, and I'm looking forward to today's study. Of course, I'm going to have to listen to it through the recording that we're making, because I'm off shortly to participate in making the minyan for They Should Be Comforted, Vera and Rob Silver. Rob lost his mother, Lillian Silver, and I'm going to leave this in Amy's good hands to do the technical behind the scenes stuff and let people in, and at the end kind of let folks make their comments and ask Charlie questions. But wanted to start us off this morning in with gratitude that we're celebrating Hanukkah this way, with rededicating ourselves to Chaburah, to our Torah study, to our communal Torah study. And this is not the only opportunity this week to engage in study. So you're here today, Yishar Koach. Tomorrow at noon, I will lead our communal Torah study, and with a little bit of a twist on finding Hanukkah in the Torah, and also taking a look at some Rashi in the Parsha. That's been going on at noon on Mondays, and it's wonderful to have more and more folks attend, and I encourage you to attend our communal Torah study that we've moved, from the Bima on Shabbat morning to Monday at lunchtime. So come and join the community. And also
I did something.
Yeah, just stop your share for a moment, Charlie.
Let me stop share. Where do I do that?
Up on top. Move the cursor.
Red button?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it stop? Oh, there it is. Okay.
There it is. So, all right, now you've practiced and you're able to do it. We know it.
Yeah, I don't know I actually don't know what I was showing you guys.
Careful now. Have your slide presentation in presentation mode already, Charlie. And then when you share your screen, when you say share, you'll already have the presentation mode of your Google Docs behind, if you will, behind the Zoom screen that you could share. Okay, that's how you do it. So anyhow, this week, my classes on Wednesday and Thursday morning will also have a little bit of a Hanukkah twist vis-a-vis the Talmud on Wednesday night, and Thursday morning for Siddur class, and then 7:30 on Thursday night, Mark Ashley will also bless the community with a lecture about perspectives on Hanukkah lighting. So please do tune in to learning routinely this week so we can continue to dedicate ourselves to Torah study as a community as we are now. The Shiva details for the Silvers are going out as well, and will come around a little later on the email lines. 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock for Shiva visits this week, Monday through Thursday, and Mariv at 7 o'clock. Mariv online at 7 o'clock this week. So back to Charlie's presentation this morning. Chaburah is in tradition of having started our communal Torah studies and reading the Joseph stories with biochemistry in mind and a little archaeology too. Without further ado, Charlie, Yishar Koach in advance, and thank you for this. Remember, folks, that if you have a little button on the right-hand corner, when you hover over the right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, you can choose speaker view, and that will give you Charlie's shared screen and Charlie as the presenter in your box. You can go back to gallery view later by hitting gallery view. So I encourage you to do so, because we're going to spotlight Charlie's video. And if you then choose speaker, you will get Charlie, and you will get Charlie and his slides once you choose the speaker view in your upper right-hand corner. Shavua Tov and happy Hanukkah to all.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Okay, I think what I'm going to start with is how this talk came to be. One day that the rabbi and I were talking, we actually talking about food and eating over our holidays, and we were talking about some of the negative aspects of that, you know, high cholesterol, gaining weight. And I said, you know, cells are really good at keeping the molecules they want to keep, that they need. And we were talking about, so cholesterol, I know you see it as a negative molecule, but it's actually a molecule you need, and your body keeps it. And you need calories, and evolutionarily, we didn't have access to a lot of calories. So when we have excess calories, we do a good job of keeping hold of them in the form of fat. Anyway, one of the things I said is that this process in the cell, the cell's ability, or the body's ability to hold on to these precious commodities, reminds me of the Joseph story, where when Joseph predicted that there would be a famine, he came up with a plan for Pharaoh to gather up the grain so people would have food during the famine. To me, it's sort of like the same general theme. So that's where we're going to start our discussion. And if I could find my documents here, my computer is behaving very bizarrely. It doesn't like all this stuff. So let's go over here, make sure I'm covering everything. So I just want to give you a couple of pieces of background about Egypt first. My computer doesn't like all this stuff on. It's got very. Give me 1 second.
If you need, Charlie, I can also share your slides if that would be easier.
I may ask you to share the slides, because my computer's really. I have to upgrade this computer. It's really belching away.
No problem. Why don't you let me worry about the technology? You'll just let me know when you want me to move to the next slide.
Okay, I'll say slide 1 or slide 2 or something like that. We're not going to get to slide 1 for a little while.
Okay, should I share the screen? Should I share it right now?
No. When I say slide 1, we'll
Perfect.
get to it. It's not like the time when someone dropped my whole carousel of slides and tried to put them together, and they were all out of order. But anyway, so the first thing I want to say is Egypt at the time of Joseph wasn't so ancient. It was a great and amazing place that had an agricultural system in place that fed a lot of people. By what I read at the time of Joseph, Egypt probably encompassed about 1 to 3 million people. Agriculture was a key to their economy. They kept their people healthy with their food. I'm going to talk a little bit about the diseases at the time. I'm going to, at least based on the evidence that I was able to find, there were very few diseases that they were able to, that modern day archaeologists, or whoever looks at this, were able to detect that were related to deficiency diseases. They seem to have had ancient Egyptians seem to have a good diet. I also want to talk about the fact that Joseph was not specifically prepared for the responsibility he was given, that Pharaoh gave him. You know, he made the prediction to Pharaoh about the famine, but you know, his CV, he was from like a Bedouin nomadic tribe, and he's in this, you know, it's sort of like he came from Podunk someplace and then wound up in New York City, and all of a sudden is running the Department of Agriculture. So, so I want to talk about Egypt. I want to talk about Joseph, who he was, how he rose to the occasion. And I also want to contrast Joseph's abilities and Joseph's successes as a leader to how he deals with his brothers when they come to town to pick up food. A lot of people don't like the way Joseph behaved, but I want to contrast Joseph's two behaviors: his excellent behavior as a leader, and the behaviors that we sort of find unpalatable with respect to the way he treated his brothers. And I want to contrast those and sort of contrast and compare that to modern times. I just want to give you a little framework about how I think about these things. You know, I'm a biochemist. Approaching religion is a little strange for me sometimes because of the way the lines of proof for the two different disciplines work. But I want to talk a little bit about agriculture. A lot of us know what agriculture did. It It guaranteed us a supply of food. We didn't have to be hunter-gatherers anymore. We decreased our dependence on game meat, which had metabolic consequences. Game meat is not very fatty. When you get a chance, go into the fish market, compare the salmon from the Copper River run to the farm-raised salmon. The farm-raised salmon is very fatty. It's also deeper in color because they feed it vitamin C, because salmon don't make their own vitamin C. So, so we started getting more fat in our diet. Evolutionarily, we adopted to eating roasted game meat, and now we depend on a farm economy. Farm economy guarantees us food. It also allowed for big societies to form. Big societies of people who are not genetically related to each other. And I want you to compare the population of Egypt or a population like a modern day city like in New York, California, or even a small town like on Long Island, and compare all these genetically unlike people to the nomadic tribe that Joseph came from, where it's made up of all these half brothers. They're much more genetically alike, and they sort of got along. The big populations, we started getting along with each other, having relations with each other without being genetically alike and without necessarily having even a sexual relationship. It's like an important aspect of a largest city. Leaders of these big societies, they want content societies. So they want a healthy society. To me, a healthy society is one that's physically, socially, and mentally healthy. If you're thinking about where your next meal is coming from, you're not healthy. You're worried. So there's discontent in society. I don't care if you're a leader if you're the president of the United States or if you're Pharaoh back 5,000 years ago, you were worried about the same thing. You didn't want your population rebelling because they're hungry. And we see that happen sometimes, and we try to control that. So I might pick up on a couple of other things. So that's the framework of my thinking. I think I mentioned everything. I'm looking through my notes now. I tend to run ahead of myself. I just want to mention one other thing. Biologically, when I teach, I'm a biochemist, but I behave more like a cell biologist. That should explain all my psychology to you. But the first thing that we try to get every morning, whether you like this or not, is calories. You need calories. You need energy to start your day. If I was in biochemistry, I'd say the first thing you got to do is make glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. You got to burn your glucose. And those excess calories sometimes give us problems, but those are long-term problems. The problem of the day is to get calories. Farming guaranteed those calories. You didn't have to go hunt for the deer. You didn't have to go gathering fruit and worry about falling out of a tree. You had a farmer to do it. I just want to touch on modern day society, give you an idea what modern day farms do. I'm going to just touch on wheat. Each year, our per capita consumption of wheat in the United States is 185 pounds of wheat per year. You get a lot of it in bread, spaghetti. They might add some wheat and other foods that you don't really notice, but we need 185 pounds of wheat each a year. U.S. grows that on 50 million acres of land. That's equal to about 60,000 central parks. And they grow the wheat, they process the wheat, they package the wheat, they get it to you, and you go buy your challah on Friday for about $5. And it's an amazing thing that's done. Egypt was doing the same thing. The population was smaller. They didn't have a combine harvester. They had no mechanical servants, but they were doing the same thing for about 1 million or so people. Okay, Joseph was released from prison, according to our text, on Rosh Hashanah 2230. That corresponds to 1531 BCE. Early in the New Kingdom period of Egypt, the Pharaoh at that time was Amenhotep the first. Forgive me for any mispronunciations. I picked this all up by visiting the Metropolitan Museum of Art and reading a bunch of books.
Charlie, I believe it's Amenhotep, something like that.
Amenhotep. Yeah, there is an HO there. I tend to leave the middle syllables out of words. I had an interview once with someone who detected that. He was able to tell where I grew up in both the Bronx and Long Island by my accent. He had specialized in, he's a scientist, he specialized in that. It was his hobby. So we're looking at Joseph early in the New Kingdom. Now I put together a 500-year period, Middle Kingdom, Second Intermediate Period, early New Kingdom, which started about 2000 BC and spanned to about 1500 BCE. Joseph about 1531 BCE. About 200 years prior to the Middle Kingdom, there was a drought, and archaeologists have figured out that drought. That drought is understood. They're able to figure it out because the Nile is fed by the White Nile and the Blue Nile, and you can look at the sediment differences over time from the contributed from the White Nile and the Blue Nile. The color names of the river already tell you something about the sediment being different, and you're able to check when droughts occurred in Egypt. This was a major drought. It did severe damage to Egypt. They had to reunify their government during the Middle Kingdom. A pharaoh came in, or a leader came in, I guess who became pharaoh. He had a 51-year reign. The first thing he did was start building his tomb. It seems like funerals were very important to pharaohs and maybe other people. So the new leadership came in. They moved the seat of government from Memphis to Thebes. Thebes is modern day Luxor. Memphis is modern day Cairo. And if we have the first slide, which will show two maps, I'm going to go to the map right now. Oh, cool. It's working. All right. Oh, I'm able to move the pointer, which is groovy. I'm going to take some pictures as I go for the newsletter because I am the newsletter guy. Oh, if we could go back to the first slide, Amy. Which way? The very first slide, number one, the map. We're going to get to all these cool slides. All right, so if we look here at the slide, this is Egypt around the time of Joseph. You see the Nile. This town here that's where Joseph's wife came from, the wife he got in Egypt from the priest. We'll talk about that in a moment. Memphis is, let me see, Memphis is over here. This is where the seat of government was at one time. They moved the seat of government way down here. It's not shown on this map, south to Thebes. Thebes was sort of like across the river from the Valley of the Kings. This is an important place right here, the Fayum. During Joseph's time, Egypt developed this to be a farming area. And when you study this area, it tells you something about Egypt's technology. I mean, I know they built the pyramids. We know but this lake here, I have to look at the name of it, Maurice or something like that. They actually engineered the lake so they could control the flooding of the arable lands. They wanted to increase the amount of arable lands. They were purposely increasing the amount of land they could grow wheat on. You're talking about an amazing advanced society. This is exactly what we do now. We may have bulldozers and cranes to help us do it. They did it by hand, but they did it. These are significant things. Up here is the frontier region. This is the Sinai. You go up here, up here on this map, there's Canaan. Frontier region, again, this is a place where Egypt was trying to control its border. I also think this is sort of where like Yul Brynner left off like Charlton Heston in the movie and said, go out to the desert and, be commander of the snakes and the sand or whatever, and I'll keep the woman. You remember that scene? I think that happened here. That's where he kicked out. If we go to the second map, these are the trade routes. So here's Egypt. This part of Egypt is now shown here in the map. These purple lines are trade routes. The green routes are war routes. This trade route going up to Lebanon, Canaan, and all, this is where Egypt was getting its cedar wood and everything. They had major trade routes. And so that means they had people coming in, importing, they were importing stuff. They had travelers coming in. They were able to put up these travelers. You know, they had places for them to stay. They were able to serve them wheat, bread. They were able to serve them beer. These lines here are probably where Joseph's brothers came. This is Canaan up here. I don't know what they're calling it over here. This is Canaan. This is, you know, Joseph's brothers probably came in along here with any of the other nomadic Bedouin tribes that would come into Egypt. I also think that 400 years later, the Exodus, Moses took the people either on this route or this route down here through the Sinai. We're not going to talk about that today. But the important thing is Egypt was a major thoroughfare. I read a little bit about the pyramids. The Metropolitan Museum of Art had a webinar on some of the pyramids. It took like 10 to 30,000 people to build a pyramid. They had to have a support system. They had to feed them when they went to their barracks at night to go to sleep. You had to have beer for them. They supplied all this, and they imported these workers from different places, just like we do now, to build a pyramid. And by the way, according to the people at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the pyramids were gleaming white. So if you approach the pyramids, basically you were blinded by the reflection of the sun on the pyramids, which I find an amazing thing. All right, if we could go back to the regular screen now. I'm going to talk a little bit about Joseph, what he had to do. Wow, my computer's really belching. So we talked a little bit about the Fayum, the development of it. The trade routes. I'm not exactly sure where Joseph stayed while he was in Egypt. I don't know where he was imprisoned, but maybe somewhere around On in northern Egypt by Memphis. I don't know, or maybe by Thebes. So those were the hot places. Food in Egypt, they had grain. They had barley and emmer wheat, maybe encorn wheat. They're not clear on that. Emmer wheat makes a good bread. It has a lot of gluten. The modern day varieties at least are good at resisting mold, which is good if you want to store the wheat for a while. It's not difficult to grow emmer wheat in the environment of the Nile. The wheat was native to the Fertile Crescent. It's been around since Neolithic times, so it obviously survived. It's pretty easy to process. They also had barley, which makes good beer and is also used for animal feed. They may have had the hullus barleys, which have been easy to process. The things I read, no one was really clear about that. Staple foods included bread, which is inexpensive. It gets you your calories every day. It's easy to get out to the masses because it doesn't go bad. It's a decent source of protein. It's not as good as chicken. Like in the United States, we get most of our protein from chicken, actually. We consume about 110 pounds of chicken each a year in this country. But it's a decent source of protein. It has a good array of amino acids. When I look at it, it doesn't seem to be specifically deficient in any of the amino acids. And you also pick up a couple of minerals. The Egyptians had beer. I read that they actually invented beer. I didn't confirm that. And it may have been safer to drink the beer than the water. And we're going to get to that when we talk about some of the diseases in Egypt. The Egyptians also got their milk from cows and goats and I think donkeys. Milk is another excellent supply of protein. They also got protein from wild fish and wild fowl. Meat from like cows was expensive. I read a story where even pharaohs, the lower level pharaohs, the lower level leaders, didn't have meat every day. Our archaeologists have like copies of like their food delivery orders. Again, like us, you know, you write out your order, you give it to your servant, or they actually had deliveries come to their house, at least the wealthier people. And they will see the Pharaoh, that some of the lower level leaders, some of the lower level pharaohs, I'm not totally sure of the hierarchy there, didn't buy meat every day. It was too costly. And they had vegetables and like we did our onions, garlic. I read through a couple of recipes. Some of the recipes sound almost exactly like what we cook now. They had sweet fruits like figs and dates, and spices like cumin. So I would have been happy with cumin, and rosemary, dill. So I would have been perfectly happy. They didn't seem to have oregano and some of the others I use, but they had them. So you were able to make yourself a pretty good meal. I just want to mention something about diseases in ancient Egypt. Remember, they don't have a body, a live body they could examine, but you can look at mummies and using CT scans and some other approaches, get an idea of what some of the diseases were. Ancient Egyptians did have scurvy, which is a deficiency of vitamin C. I actually wasn't surprised by that. Vitamin C is actually a harder vitamin to get. Like the British were called limeys because they started carrying limes on their ship because British sailors had a problem with scurvy. Vitamin C, actually a little tricky to get. I mean, we get it because it's just so available. Oranges are just very available. And potatoes are another source of vitamin C. They had various bone diseases. And when I first read about that, I said, oh, calcium vitamin D deficiency. Archaeologists don't attribute that to the vitamin D deficiency. They actually attribute the bone diseases in ancient Egypt to tuberculosis. And one of the other problems when we started leaving Bedouin nomadic tribes and coming together in great societies, it also allowed for pandemics to occur, which is what's happening to us right now. And so as we start living close together, diseases like TB become more prevalent. They had chronic anemia. And again, the first thing I said in my mind, oh, iron deficiency. They didn't attribute it to that. They attributed, the people studied this, attributed it to a parasite that the Egyptians were picking up in the Nile. It's a parasite that, I can't remember the name of it, but it's a parasite that bores up through the feet, gets in the urinary tract, burrows into the bladder, and causes bleeding from the bladder. So they believed the Egyptians were actually, who had anemia, were losing blood through their bladder, that they did not have iron deficiencies. Other diseases, in addition to the infectious disease, they had malaria. They also had signs of heart disease, cancer, lung disease. The lung disease, they believe, came from the desert sands. Breathing in all that desert sand caused damage to the lung. They had tooth decay, which archaeologists do not associate with sugar intake. The ancient Egyptians eat a lot of raw sugar. It really wasn't available. They didn't have sugar cane. And they attribute that to sand in their mouths from the desert, and also the stone used to grind bread, that they actually were damaging their teeth from that. The take-home point, the reason I gave you all this is the only deficiency disease I picked up on, the reason I emphasized that the deficiency diseases was the vitamin C deficiency. It sort of suggests that they had a good diet, that they had most of the nutrients they needed. The anemia was not attributed to deficiencies of vitamin B12 or iron, which indicated enough animal sources of protein, protein from animal sources. And they seem to have had their calories and even the size of their bodies. They weren't as tall as we are. Our average height's about 5'10". I think I read their average height was about 5'6". It's not that much shorter. Short stature can be associated with, certain genetic alterations, but it's also associated with poor quality diet. They seem to be attaining their height, which indicates a reasonably good diet. So Egypt was feeding its population. And so a drought would make them nervous. They wouldn't be able to feed it. Now, if I go back to the slides, I want to show you a whole bunch of slides I picked up from the museum that give you an idea of life in Egypt. And if we go over to slide 2, these little models, these are actual models from Egypt around 1900 BCE. They were picked out of the tomb of a leader. There's a little room across from at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's sort of across from the Rainey Auditorium. Go in that room and spend some time there. I've gone there many times. I find the room amazing. This first picture is a model. Oh, I'm using my finger. This is a granary. Over down here, you see some people with like wooden boards, and here with like measuring bins. They're actually taking in grain. They're recording the amount of grain, and they're measuring it. Back here are sacks of grain they're dumping in for storage. Over here, you see this guy with the pointy stick? He's the overseer. And in almost all the scenes I'm going to show you, there's always an overseer with like this pointy baton or stick. I don't think he has the pointy baton or stick because he likes to have coffee with you. Now, if you go over here, this is just a close-up. It shows sort of this side of the room. Here's the guys with the papyrus, files recording the intake of grain. And over here again, here are the people with the measuring cups. If we go to the second slide, the next slide. Again, this is just a close-up. This is the same picture as before. This is just a close-up of the guys with the grain. You see they're dumping it into storage pits. Now, if we go to the next slide, this comes from a paper written by an Islamic scholar who is writing about Joseph. These are believed to be the pits that Joseph used to store grain. They're capable of holding up to 200 tons of grain. They're underground, which is kind of cool. Let me just find if I'm leaving anything out there. Underground, which is kind of cool. They were able to keep the grain at a constant ambient temperature, which is important. And away from thieves, away from vermin, and they were able to store grain. Now, I read something as storing grain, you know, you could buy bleached flour. There's sort of the bleaching of the flour sort of makes the gluten a little bit better for baking. If you store grain for a long time, the gluten in the grain becomes more oxidized over the time and is better for baking. So stored flour is actually a little bit, the bread rises better. I'm not going to go into all that. I'm sorry, I'm just looking through my notes. I always run ahead of myself. So we have the underground storage. They also had bins, clay pots, earthenware baskets. They had all kinds of ways to store the grain, but they were able to store a large amount of grain underground. Again, you're talking about sophisticated. You know, the United States does the same thing. You remember when President Reagan released cheese to everyone because the United States just stored tons of cheese. We store tons of oil in this country. We do all kinds of things like that. Egypt is doing the same thing. Next slide. This is a really cool picture. This is again from the tomb from around 1900 BCE. We'll get to who this guy was in a bit. This is a bakery and a brewery on the left here. This is the brewery. You see women back here. They're sort of grinding the grain. This guy is making the malt. And here they're putting it into these bottles, which have these like black clay tops. So they're actually processing and making beer, which is going to be stored, and they're going to have beer. Here's the overseer with the pointy stick. There is always an overseer in every single one of these pictures. On this side's a bakery. You see the same thing. There's some people here. I didn't take the duplicate pictures here, so you don't have the good close-ups. But here's some people, they're grinding away. Here are the women grinding. It seems like the women ground the flour, ground the grain. And these are people processing the bread. And back here, they're shaping and baking the bread. These black objects here are actually ovens. So a bakery and brewery, they had this process. Had the granary where they took the grain in, they stored the grain, they processed the grain to bread and to beer. I want to go to the next picture, a stable. This is a stable. The other thing they used grain for was feeding their cattle. These 4 cattle are feeding on from a manger. these two guys, these two cattle here being hand-fed, they're being fed grain and fodder, according to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. See this black cow? He can't stand. He's gotten so fat, he can't stand. The little blurb at the Metropolitan specifically points that out, that the cow was very fat, very well fed. Again, you see this guy here, he's the overseer with the pointy stick. I'm not sure who this is. This probably another worker. I can't remember who that was. In the next slide, slaughtering cows. They're slaughtering cows here. And the reason I took pictures of these to take home to you is they use cows for meat, so they fed them grain. But I want to show you their slaughter pictures. Let's just look at the slaughterhouse first. Here's the guy with the pointy stick, the overseer, and overseer. Lots of overseers here. Here's a cow trust. Here's a cow trust, and they're slaughtering the cow. Back here, some slabs of meat. Okay, we come up to this close-up picture. You see the knife. They're cutting the throat. You see this? This is they're collecting this pot here. They're collecting blood. They're making blood pudding. They had a slaughterhouse. They made their meat. And if we go to the next slide, there's another close-up. Notice the slitting the throat. That should sound familiar to us with the way we process our kosher meat. We sort of bleed the animal out from the neck. Not unknown in Egypt, a little bit of overlap in our cultures. Here's the blood pudding. Blood pudding would be an excellent source of iron. That's why blood is red. And you also notice that processing some geese or ducks too. Next picture. I may have another. That's a real close-up of the shohet. And here's the guy with the pointy stick. He's making sure you're working. He's the overseer. Let me get a picture of this. I'm sort of like lagging for the newsletter here. Wait, excuse me 1 minute. My computer camera. Okay. All right. Oh, this next picture is very cool. So we got through the slaughter. This is an offering procession. The guy who died, you see his name back here in the museum, Mekatri. I'll see it better before. These are believed to be his kids at his funeral. This first young man, which is believed to be his son, coming with a libation and an incense burner. The second son is coming with linens. The museum points out that some of the linen is red. These two women are important. One of them is coming with bread and beer and a duck or a goose. The second woman is coming with bread. This is in this bin, there's square bread. This is conical bread. Obviously, there must have been a significant difference. She's also coming with a duck. They're believed to be his 4 kids. So you can see when the Egyptians clearly had a sophisticated way of processing food, storing food. They had a Department of Agriculture that was amazing. You go to the next slide, it's fine. These pictures were of models taken from the tomb of Meketri. It was a tomb in Thebes. He was like an assistant to leadership to Pharaoh or to whoever. He had various jobs like counting grain, on the judiciary, as a chief of various departments within the Egyptian government. So he's an important guy. If we go to the next slide, this just shows how they found all those models in the tomb. There's some boats there to look at too. So this is how they found the tomb and where they recovered those wooden models. Those wooden models, again, they also show the quality of the art at the time, and they were able to tell you their history, their the Egyptian history and Egyptian art at the time. Okay, we're through with the slides. Let's go back to Jumpin' Joseph. I'm sorry, my computer's really slow. So we talked about food in Egypt. I gave you proof that Egypt was a sophisticated story. So Parshat Miketz opens up with Joseph being released from prison, and he's released from prison because the Chamberlain of Cupbearers is worried about Pharaoh's dream, and and he knew Joseph was able to interpret dreams well because he interpreted both the cupbearer's dream and the baker's dream correctly. The baker didn't do so well. Pharaoh has a pair of dreams, as you know. The 7 unhealthy cows from the Nile eat up the 7 healthy cows from the Nile. And there's essentially the same dream with the grain. The poor quality grain eats up the high quality grain. And this dream is very problematic to Pharaoh. Pharaoh takes the dream to his wise leaders, his astrologers, his dream interpreters, his magicians, and he doesn't, at least according to Midrashic and Talmudic interpretation, he does not like any of the interpretations from any of his leaders. The cupbearer is worried about Pharaoh being overthrown or not being Pharaoh anymore. So he wants the dream interpreted because the cupbearer likes his job as cupbearer. It must be a pretty plush job. And he tells Pharaoh all about Joseph. And Pharaoh summons Joseph from prison. Joseph gets ready for his interview. He has his hair cut. He gets dressed in a new clean set of clothes. Want you to keep in mind the Nile is considered a god to Egypt. And Egypt's farming depends on the rise and the fall of the flood. So when Joseph interprets this dream for Pharaoh and attributes it to the wisdom of his God, of Joseph's God, there's sort of this attack on the Nile god, and Pharaoh accepts this. We sort of see this again with the plagues. Each of the plagues I once learned was an attack on the Egyptian god. There was a frog god, there was a cow god, there was the Nile god, the Nile turned to blood. So this is like an attack on the Nile god in a way. The Nile god is not behaving for you. I also want to point out that throughout like a lot of Egyptian history and even in other histories and in Gilgamesh and other epic stories, there are references to 7-year famines. I don't know why, I couldn't figure out, I don't know why 7 years is important. Maybe someone else knows, and if you want to pull that up, it's fine. I also mentioned at around 2200 BCE, there was a famine in Egypt that led to a fall of Egypt and the reunification and where Joseph is now. So we're now Joseph 1531 BCE. He's interpreted Pharaoh dreams. Pharaoh is happy. Pharaoh's so happy. He exalts the wisdom of Joseph's God. He says, the wisdom of God is in you, Joseph. He appoints Joseph. Joseph tells him, you know, you got to get overseers to do, you got to collect all the grain. You got to collect all the grain during the 7 years of plenty. You got to put it away. And you have to appoint overseers to do this. Those overseers with the pointy sticks that you saw in the picture are overseers. Pharaoh makes Joseph the overseer. Joseph, remember, is a foreigner, a Hebrew, the slave. He has no CV. There's nothing on his CV. He comes from a Bedouin tribe. That Bedouin tribe is going to come to Egypt in a little while and ask to buy food because they're being hit by the same famine that they didn't predict. Joseph predicted with the help of God. Somewhere in the Midrash, it says that Joseph dreamed those Nile dreams at the same time Pharaoh did. So even though Pharaoh didn't give Joseph a complete story on all those dreams, Joseph knew what was happening. So God was helping Joseph along. So there's this indication that God was choosing Joseph. So Pharaoh chose Joseph, but so did God. I'll leave some of that to the rabbi to talk about. I don't want to get too much into theology. But so Pharaoh appoints Joseph. Joseph makes Joseph second in charge of Egypt. The only person above Joseph is Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells him this story. He says, I am the only person above you. He tells Pharaoh tells his other underlings, his other supporters, his other leaders that could we find another like him, a man in whom is the Spirit of God. He loves Joseph. He tells Joseph, no man will move his hand or foot without your approval. He gave Joseph a lot of power. And Pharaoh convinced all his leaders of this. Joseph receives from Pharaoh a signet ring straight from his hand. That ring basically gave Joseph the power to sign his name, to sign checks, to sign law. So Joseph the foreigner is in charge. Joseph gets a new set of clothing. It's his final change of clothing. He gets a gold chain. He gets a chariot. Chariots were only introduced to Egypt about 1,000 years before, about 100 to 200 years before Joseph's time. Joseph gets a wife, a priest of On, and it seems like that priest either is or somehow related to Potiphar, the guy who took him as a slave and imprisoned him because of Potiphar's wife's infidelities, not Joseph's infidelities. Joseph was wrongly imprisoned. And I also read somewhere, I'm not going to get into this, that wife actually came from the Bedouin tribes, that she was an adopted wife, but I was getting too much. It was sort of like interesting to read, but it was too much of a tangent. Joseph gets a household staff, and he has major control of money with regard to grain sales. You sort of see this when Joseph returns the money to his brothers. You know, Joseph can sell you grain, but he can also give it to you. That's it's a power. And remember, by selling grain, Joseph is earning money for the government of Egypt. The government of Egypt earned money by selling grain to foreigners. Another amazing thing. What was Joseph's responsibility? He had to feed 1 to 3 million people. He had to keep that population from revolting and being unhappy during a famine. It had to continue to protect its frontiers. You had to keep its army fed. They're saying army lives or moves on its stomach or its diet, whatever that saying is. He had to keep the economy going for Pharaoh. Income, I mentioned that before. Joseph was successful. The Torah says famine was in all the land, but in Egypt there was bread. Joseph was successful. So the guy with no credentials from the nomadic Hebrew tribe, the slave, saved Egypt. How and why? He does several things with his power. He collects grain. He goes throughout all Egypt. He collects grain. He stores it. Does this by putting a tax levy on people. He increases that tax levy. I think this is according to Midrash, from 1/10 of all production to 1/5. He doubled the tax. And Pharaoh said, fine. Joseph does it, fine. He stored the grain. He kept records on grain storage. He sold grain. When giving out grain during the famine, according to a midrash, he required the uncircumcised to get circumcised. I guess there was a little bit of difference in modesty then, but here's the key thing. When the people who had to be circumcised went to Pharaoh to complain, Pharaoh said, hey, Joe's the man. Do whatever Joseph tells you to do. He put Joseph in charge. And Joseph also provides grain to his brothers with subterfuge. A second child, he made money. So he made money for Egypt during what might be called an economic downturn caused by a famine. He took command of his family when his brothers got to town to look for food, to buy food, and he had Pharaoh's complete and full backing. The Midrash also states that Joseph did not indulge in the pleasantries of life during the famine. So he must have been, to me, that means he was very into his work. I always like people who, like when I run a lab, I like lab workers who are obsessed. So he was obsessed with his work. That would make me happy. So I guess it made Pharaoh happy. The people bowed to Joseph. Things like that. Okay, so now his brothers come to town. So we've established Joseph is a great leader. He rose to the occasion. No CV, he rose to that occasion. his brothers come to town, and he sort of treats them badly. They come to town, they want to buy grain. He first confines them for about 3 days. Then he says, I'm sending you back. I'm sending you with grain. You buy the grain. I'm sending you with the grain, but you're going to leave Simon with me because I want you to come back with Benjamin. And so the brothers go off with the grain, with Benjamin in prison. They go home to Jacob. Jacob's upset. Jacob's upset that Simon is not there, that Joseph is dead. And it brings back that memory. And they want Benjamin now. Egypt wants Benjamin. And then they find the money in their sacks. So the brothers are all upset. They're fighting, they're arguing. They finish they eat all the grain that Joseph's given them. And then they first go back to Egypt. Makes you wonder if the famine stopped, if they would have just forgot about Simon being back there in Egypt. But they had to go back to Egypt because they ran out of food. So they go back to Egypt, and they have dinner with Joseph. Joseph sort of has dinner by himself because he can't have dinner with his brothers because, they're just low-life Hebrews. He can't have dinner with the Egyptians because Egyptians don't actually eat with a Hebrew. So Joseph's sort of this leader all by himself. He sends the brothers off again with grain, puts the money back, puts the goblet in Benjamin's sack. They leave, but then Joseph sends his people after his brothers, and they say, "Oh, behold, look, the money is there, the goblet's there. You come back with us. Benjamin's going to be a slave." They eventually make up, but he does give his brothers a hard time. What does this tell us about Joseph? I'm going to compare Joseph, and I'm going to compare it a little bit to modern day leadership too, modern day people I've worked for. You have Joseph, this great leader, rose to the occasion, saved Egypt, saved Canaan, took control of things, took control of his brothers, second in charge of Pharaoh, but he had these behaviors we find unpalatable. I'm going to tell you, based even on modern day behaviors of many people I've worked with, and I'm sure you have worked with, you have these people who do great things, but they have horrible behaviors. You look at, there's one fellow I know of, discovered a wonderful drug, important drug. I'm not going to name the drug. I'm not going to name him. But he was he was an alcoholic, a raving lunatic. But he made a major contribution to medicine, to your health. I worked for many wonderful people. I would have to go to a funeral. I'll mention her name. I did my postdoc for a woman named Aura Rosen. Some of you may know her. I remember Aura, and you work 7 on a Sunday. I got there between 10 and 11 in the morning and left at 7. I won't tell you what the other 6 days of the week were like. And she still thought you weren't working enough. I had one day when I wanted to go to Aunt's funeral. I said, Aura, I'm going to go to a funeral. She looks at me. She just looks at me, stares at me, says, "It's your career." Walks off. Wonderful scientist. Discovered and cloned and isolated the insulin receptor. Her lab told us a lot about how it worked. Major contributions to the field. Wasn't very personable. Would you throw her out as leader? Would you want to choose her as the leader of the lab? Yes. Would you want to pal around with her? Would you want her around at your shiva? Maybe not. And I think the Torah is telling us about understanding one of the things the Torah is telling us, a lot of things, but one of the things the Torah is telling us is that about the qualities of people, that people rise to the occasion, but it doesn't mean everything about them is perfect. I got into some discussion with the rabbi about God pulling the strings and how much of the strings God is pulling. The rabbi's not here, so I don't want to have to, if he was here, we'd have more of a conversation about it. But when I first started talking to him, I was putting God out there as more controlling, and the rabbi was pushing for me to push back a little bit on that to think about it. And one of the examples he threw out to me was think about Jonas Salk. Rabbi's a smart guy. It was something he didn't know about me too. When I first wanted to be, I had a couple of heroes: Salk, Linus Pauling, or Rosen, the woman I worked for. A lot of these people were my heroes. They still are. They all have their flaws. Linus Pauling, 2 Nobel Prizes, probably should have won a third. If he didn't win that Nobel Peace Prize, he would have won the third. He would have saw the structure of DNA because he would have been able to travel to Britain. He would have seen the structure of DNA, and he would have come up with the structure of DNA instead of Watson, Crick, and all the Michigas they did, because he had just done the structure of the 3-dimensional structure of protein, the alpha helix structure of protein. I'm sorry, tangent. But
Rosalind Franklin. I have to just add Rosalind Franklin.
Rosalind Franklin. Yeah, she was a postdoc. That happens in all labs. The head of the lab gets the Nobel. I don't think he deserved the Nobel Prize. I don't think the whole Franklin lab deserved the Nobel Prize. All he did was crystallize and look at the structure. The key was Watson and Crick. But the thing was, if Linus Pauling saw it, he would just looked at the X-ray diffraction pattern and said, alpha helix, and threw it aside because he already did this with the alpha helix on protein. But the United States didn't let him out of the country because he was railing against nuclear power as a weapon. So he got a Nobel Prize in peace. I guess it was a consolation prize to a Nobel Prize in physiology and chemistry, physiology and medicine, as his first one was in chemistry. Well, but Linus Pauling had a weakness. Later on in his life, he went on this like crazy tangent about vitamin C. No science in that, no nothing. He like went berserk. Smart guy. If you've ever been in the room with him, absolute genius. He was like he'd ask one of these penetrating questions and like know the answer or foresee the answer. Amazing guy, but got off in this crazy everyone has their weakness. Ask my daughter about mine. Yeah, it's what I want to take another picture of us. Oh look, what am I doing here? So what I'm saying is you have to accept. Oh God, I did that terribly. So you have to accept, like, you can't have a perfect leader. You can't have a perfect person. I'll open up to questions. I'll also accept questions on anything you'd like, including like any of the biological things I said.
Thank you so much, Charlie. So let's, I'll make a wrap-up comment at the end because I want to get back to your discussion on how much is God pulling the strings, but I'm going to save that.
Yeah, you're a rabbi, so I don't want to do too much of that. I get too much into theology, and
I'm going to save that. I'm going to wrap that up at the end. But if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself. I see Diane Aaron have a question.
It's not so much a question, but a comment, and that is that I don't think Joseph acted that badly when his brothers came to Egypt. They really did not. He was a snotty teenager. There's no question about that. But they really did him dirt. And while he forgave them and said, God made this happen, and all of this has worked out for the very best, I don't have a problem with him giving them a bit of a hard time.
They had it coming.
Yeah, exactly. As Aaron said, they had it coming to them. If you have a sibling, things happen. But the other comment I wanted to make, and it was part of our Torah study discussion on Monday, was that I also don't like the idea of God being the marionette, manipulator so much, because it takes away our free will. So we supposedly have some free will, and yes, God may set things in motion, but I don't see God as the chess master. That just takes away any notion of free will.
I just want to ask you, because I remember, because your comment on Monday in the Torah study class actually was part of my thinking, and I'm sort of you and I are sort of dealing with that same issue. And when the rabbi mentioned Jonas Salk, it's like, did God tell Salk how to do the polio vaccine? So like the Torah definitely says that God is pulling some strings, because at least in the Midrash anyway, you know, at least in the Midrash, there's the point where the Midrash says that, you know, Joseph dreamed the same dream about the Nile that Pharaoh had. So, you know, so Joseph had the crib notes, if you will, from God. You know, but then Joseph made his decisions later. And, you know, I guess I'd be more direct with Joseph. I would have seen the brothers. I would have just said, screw you, go home without food. But that would have been me. And I would have given food to everyone else. I would have said, go beg from him. You know, I wouldn't have been so nice. But if we go back, I mentioned that Joseph required circumcision of Egyptians who weren't circumcised. That was kind of nasty. I think I read in the Midrash or Talmud. I'm sorry, I don't always pay attention to where these references are. But one of the things it said is because Jews were given a hard time for being circumcised. So if everyone was circumcised, you can't give them a hard time for being, you know, you can't identify them as a Jew. And that was Joseph's thinking, but still a pretty harsh thing to do. You know, hey, you, 52-year-old guy, get circumcised. They didn't have anesthesia then. I don't think they did.
Right. But his brothers, you may recall in the story of Dinah, part of the deal that they were going to make, they sort of made with Shem, was that all the men would be circumcised. They then took advantage of their weakness and killed them all.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he kind of had where to learn, you know?
Yeah.
Hal, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I do have a question. The Joseph story seems to have a number of different elements around the idea of revenge. You know, at the beginning, Joseph tattles on his brothers in the field, and then they throw him in the pit, getting revenge on him, and then Joseph gets revenge back on the brothers. So do you have any comment on this idea of revenge, you know, within the Joseph story? And is that something we should consider or look down on, or is it ever justifiable?
Well, I think one of the things, you know, I don't think about the theology as much. You know, I'm like a biochemist, cell biologist, and I mostly worry about metabolism and cancer cells, but I also think about how people behave. Like for instance, right now, the vaccine that's coming out now, how do you get everyone to be vaccinated? I'm a scientist. Yeah, obviously get vaccinated, but there's this thing I call a human condition. I learned that from one of my undergraduate professors by the name of Elof Carlson, who I lost track of when Sharon got sick, but and I think he passed away. But Elof was the person who taught me about the human side of science, and he was a geneticist. He was one of my genetics, but he had a human quality to him, actually, which is rare in my field. And he had this thing called the human condition, and revenge is part of the human condition. We get angry at people. Half of what I deal with in trying to develop anything, and half of what everyone else deals with, is human behavior. How many times do you have to, I've told somebody working in my lab, I tell them, you just have to work for them with the day. You just have to produce this. You don't have to go home with them. You're not married to them. And, and people get mad at each other for the littlest things. You see it in any group of people you work with. I don't think I think in some perfect world, yeah, there may not be revenge, and there may not be the things that cause revenge, but we're not God. We're not perfect, and we don't live in a perfect world. I mentioned cholesterol. Yeah, too much cholesterol causes heart disease and all that. If you don't have any, you will not be able to reproduce. You will not have your secondary sex hormones. Your cell membranes will all be as hard as butter instead of nice and fluid. You need cholesterol. I could name all, biologically, cell biology-wise, I could tell you all the reasons you need cholesterol. Then suddenly later in life, it causes you problems with arterial sclerosis. But everything's sort of this delicate balance. There's no perfect anywhere, you know. It's sort of the same thing there. The brothers did this to him, and Joseph wanted to get back. Diane argues very persuasively that Joseph was mild. I would have done worse, but some people still see Joseph as being mean. They just said, "Hey, you're my brothers. I'm power over you now. Here's some bread. Say you're sorry. Let's go make up. Let's go see the psychologist, and let's go into therapy." They didn't do that.
I mean, you know, Charlie, it's not just his brothers. He was taking a chance that his father was going to die. The famine was in Canaan as well as Egypt, and all this time was going by. His father was getting older. His father was totally distraught over what he thought happened to Joseph.
Yeah,
and even when his father found out about Joseph, he delayed in Canaan before he came back. So he was taking a chance that his father was going to die while he was literally playing.
That's an interesting point.
So he may have held it against his father because his father was the one who had him go to Shem, where terrible things happened, and terrible things happened to Joseph there. So he may have thought, well, my father's responsible for that in the way I'm getting back, but it wasn't just his brothers.
Yeah, because he wants his father. Right.
I have great difficulty forgiving him for that.
Yeah. Well, you know, that's interesting because Joseph could have easily sent a welcoming party as opposed to a garrison out to Canaan. Said, "Hey, you know, we found Joseph," or Joseph could have gone out there with them. I mean, Joseph was second in charge, and he had the Egyptian army. He could have done whatever the heck he wanted to. You know, it was whatever the Egyptian army was the equivalent of an aircraft carrier nowadays. I mean, the United States goes where it wants. Egypt went where it wanted to. Egypt was the United States of its day, which is an amazing thing to think about. Anyway.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Any other questions or comments to add to the discussion here?
By the way, I want to sell you on the museum too. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Egyptian exhibit. You could spend a lot of time there, particularly around exhibits that are biblically interesting to us, and you could pick up a lot of interesting stuff from there. There's pictures I was showing you were models from a tomb, and the little stories there. I was most actually amazed. The reason I showed it was the shot slicing the neck. I mean, definite cultural overlaps, and you'll find others. You know, one of the other overriding things was we were in Egypt, and you know, the Bible, the Torah talks about, you know, being enslaved for 400 years. But the other thing was we may have learned things about going from a nomadic society to a country. Part of the Torah is about nationhood. Again, I have a harder time gripping on the theology. For me, you grip about the theology, but I can understand the stories of learning how to build a nation, learning how to build a society, learning how to build an agricultural system. And, you know, with all due respect, you know, if you remove God from the picture, you still have an amazing story in the Torah about nationhood. And you can't ignore that, with or without God. I don't care which way you put it.
And actually, Charlie, I think it's a great, and this is what I've been thinking about since you started talking. I think it's a great discussion to have on Hanukkah. So if you all will permit me just a comment before we end. I'm not the rabbi, but I want to add.
A rabbi.
Today I'm a rabbi here. For those of you who joined late, the other Rabbi Bolton is attending the funeral for Lillian Silver. But I think that your comment about, sort of how do we deal with this? How much is God pulling the strings? And can we have the story without God? That's to me a lot of what we think about with Hanukkah, right? Because the question is put in the Talmud in Masachet Shabbat, my Hanukkah, what is Hanukkah, right? And is it about the small band of Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, who were able to overcome the Seleucid Greeks and rededicate the temple? And I'm sure that if, Charlie, you were a military expert instead of a scientist, you could probably figure out how they were able to do that despite their small number, right? Or is it about God's hand? And it was really God who was able to make that miracle happen. And was it about the cleaning and rededication of the temple, which happened because of the Maccabees, the Hashmonaim, and their probably hard work of scrubbing and pushing away the idols and lifting, our menorah and putting that all back together? Was it about that? Or was it about the miracle of the light, which came from God, that really the oil lasted for 8 days, not because of some scientific chemical reason, but because of God? To me, the answer is it's a dialectic, right? It's the both and it's a perfect example of what we have in Pirkei Avot in chapter 3, where it says Hakol tzafui v'harashut nituna. Everything is predetermined or revealed, v'harashut nituna, and free will is given. Right, it's a complete dialectic. Like, what does that mean? How can everything be predetermined, but free will is given? And I think that this whole theme in terms of Hanukkah about it's not just, the lo v'chaya lo v'choach that we read in the Haftorah yesterday. It's by God's Spirit alone. It's also our hand. And bringing it back to science and today, right? Are we waiting for God and some great miracle to end the pandemic? No, we've got scientists working on a vaccine. Did God grant them the intellect to create the vaccine? Possibly. Is it about our quest for greater scientific knowledge and understanding as Jews and as a greater people? For sure. And so I think, maybe you can hold it as a dialectic. It's both. It's not just God pulling the strings. It's not just our power, right? Because at the end of the day, I do think there is a humility in all of this, right? There's a humility and an awe. And there's a call to action. How can we use our talents? How can we use our intellect to make things happen in the world? So I think what an incredibly apropos discussion for Hanukkah, and really, personally my joy to be able to learn from you this morning. So thank you very, very much.
I always say, an interesting thing about me. When I was in graduate school, you would have never, ever predicted me being in the synagogue, much less attempting to talk about the Torah. I would just look and said, why do you want to read that for? You have to discover how this protein is working.
Well, that to me says you're willing to be in the dialectic, which is really great. Before we all go, and if anybody has any other comments, wants to stay on for a few minutes, I'm happy to do so. I just want to reinforce Thursday night, the opportunity to learn with Mark at 7:30. I believe the talk is called The Essence of Hanukkah Lighting, correct? And also on the lighter side, if you've not had sufganiyot left and you're one who's out taking walks on Tuesday, if you email Helene by the end of the day today to put in an order, we're doing a kind of drop by pickup sufganiyot, say hi to Scott, to Rabbi Bolton and Sigal. On Tuesday afternoon, I believe the pickup times are 1 to 3 and 4:30 to 5:30. If you'd like to participate and just come and pick up sufganiyot, just please email Helene by the end of the day. It's just nice to see everybody. Really nice to see you. Thank you so much, Charlie, for, I know for me and I hope I can speak for all of us, for really inspiring our learning about Joseph and enriched knowledge about life in Egypt at the time, and also maybe another way to add to our thinking about Hanukkah this year. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I mean, this is not one I would have had in my professional life.
Fantastic.
Yashika.
Wonderful
Yes, sir.
combination of things and great
Yashika.
learning, Charlie.
And I
Thank
put
you
this
so
curtain
much.
significant- Oh, thank you. Yeah,
Thank you, Charlie.
Bobby, you have to tell me what you thought too about.
I
some-
love the Egyptian collection in the Met. Everybody should go. It's unbelievable. And as beautiful as the models are, the wall painting also gives you processions of food and abundance, and you understand what a complex and rich society it was.
I surprised myself as I learned about ancient Egypt.
Thank you so much.
You enhanced our
Hag
knowledge.
Sameach.
Chag Sameach, Chag Urim
Be well.
Sameach.
Well done.
Really great, Charlie. That was a lot to think about. Really, really wonderful to have bring in the science.
Charlie, Yashikoa,
Thank you, David.
fantastic.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I didn't know how to deal with all the theology.
I'll just mention that Ron and I took a trip to Egypt from Israel several years ago, went up and down the Nile, went out to historic sites. We actually visited